Hello, Guy.
Hey, Jonathan.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. Thanks for joining us. I really just wanted to get together today to review the Alpage cheeses that we've received for this year. We're working with four dairies that we've now been working with for 5 years. I mean, three of them we've had
Yeah.
for about 5 years, and then Sermon is relatively new. Um, Before we get started kind of talking about the dairies themselves, what is Alpage cheese? Why is it special? Why does it appeal to you? Why does it appeal to Gruyere producers and Gruyere connoisseurs in general?
Well, the legend has it that we have Gruyere today because back in the day, people were making cheese during summertime on the Alp, and then this brought sufficient food during wintertime, where global warming wasn't a thing, and you really didn't have much access to food during your winter. All right, so that was what you could do to have a substantial source of protein and fats all year round. The way Gruyere tastes like today is more or less the same as how it was made on the Alp 100, 200, 300, 400 years ago. Basically, it was a hard cheese, and the purpose of making a hard cheese was to have milk preserve all year round. Because keep in mind, back then, you couldn't sterilize milk or make powder or even butter or like pasteurize anything. This wasn't a thing back then. So you just had raw milk, which you transformed into hard cheese. But again, you could because we live in an area where we have good access to wood on the mountain, and then this brings sufficient heat to produce hard cheese.
Okay.
Hence, Gruyere being as it is today, um, as heritage from those Alpage days. And then
So
Alpage is still being produced today, so obviously not 100% identical to previously, because now there is some access to electricity, but the basic principle is the same.
so what makes an Alpage dairy different from a typical year-round Gruyere dairy?
So what defines Alpage in our language and also in our country's legislation is, um, first of all, Alpage has to be seasonal. So an Alpage producer will be allowed and be encouraged via, by the government and the agriculture department to transform milk on his mountain estate, either his or someone else's that he rents, 100 days per year. All right, that's the goal. So if you count 100 days, and I think there's an allowance plus minus 10, something like that, or plus minus 20, because it has to be a minimum as well. So if it's less than, say, 80 or 90, then it can't be considered Alpage. And if it's more, then it can't as well. All right, then it's considered all year round. And if it's less, then it could be considered an accident. All right, it's not something consistent.
Right.
So first of all, it has to be seasonal. All right, so that means there's a start and there's an end. The start is usually transhumance. So you go to the mountain where you have your cows pasture, and then that's usually around May, June, and then you come down from that mountain with your cows, usually end September, early October.
What happens to those cows during the winter? Are they contributing to another dairy or just calving? What?
So we're talking specifically about Gruyere here, and there are rules as to what cows can do during the winter time. So you would tend to say, so either they produce milk at the farm in the valley just for uh, regular Gruyere, for like village dairy Gruyere. So either that, or it turns out there are some so the regulation allows some industrial production during the winter, and then the farmer can produce on his own Gruyere d'Alpage during the summer. But I think there are specific rules, and that has mostly to do with silage, for example. So like there has to be a transitional period where the cows do not have access to silage and just grass or hay, no silage, for like a safety zone.
So during the 100 days that they're up on the mountain, is it all just pasture, or is there hay? Is there, what else are they, what's the percentage there, or does it depend on the time of year? How does that work?
Yeah, so the idea, and that's also one definition of alpage, is that whatever the cows eat has to come from the site. So this is understanding the mountain chalet. The thing is that we're dealing with high yield American engineered cows, so we need to give them, the farmers need to give them some concentrated protein as a, I don't know, complementary diet, or I don't know what you call that, but that's just the bare minimum that the cow needs to, basically stay alive. The rest is just pasture on site.
What about some of these chalets that we've gone to? You've told me they have like multiple sites, so they might start lower down the mountain at the beginning of the summer and then work their way up. Is that just a factor of kind of where the grass is?
It is, and what's interesting is that it follows obviously season. So if there's a beautiful year, such as right now, the season will start earlier because it's been freezing less in, say, March or April, and maybe less snow, or there has been snow, but it melted quicker than usual. So the season starts earlier. The grass starts growing earlier, and then they can go up to the first site earlier than usual. I think this year is, depending from site to site, but it's around 2 weeks earlier. And we can also see that it's not just alpage, it's also fruits, for example. We already have huge amounts of apples, which is kind of early. And we're around 2 to 3 weeks earlier than usual because we had a good agriculture year.
For instance, let's just talk about the Chenot dairy. What is that family doing when they're not on the Alp? Like, do they get a call one day and they say, well, the season looks good, it's time to go up, and they just drop everything and go up?
So they decide on their own. Since they own the right of production and they run their own business, they get to decide when the time is right to go up. Either way, if they produce industrial milk during the winter or dairy milk, like village dairy milk, they are the ones who get to decide when the time is right. So, I mean, none of them go up at the same time. There's no like hunting season is open date.
All right, so they get up, and then can you just describe a little bit about what these dairies look like? So a lot of the people that we were, that get cheese from us, they understand these kind of typical, almost like modern dairies, white walls, tile floors, jacket vats, all these kind of closed systems. What would they encounter in an Alpage dairy that they wouldn't see in one of those more standard, like village dairy situations?
None of the above. They would encounter perhaps some tiles. They would obviously encounter copper because it's compulsory. They would perhaps encounter stainless steel objects like those pots that you put the cheese cultures in, or like the spoons, or I don't know, what do you call those? Tools, yeah? So that's that. Otherwise, it's just forgetting about anything about a proper yeah, a proper site producing cheese all year round. The only common things are copper and milk. That's the only common thing.
Across the spectrum of Alpage cheese that we get from you, is it all hanging vats over wood fires?
So it's not compulsory, but in the area we supply you cheese from, there's just a few sites which don't produce with swinging vats, and you guys don't buy cheese from those sites.
Thank you for the kind of basics on these dairies. So let's talk a little more specifically about the 2019 season. So if I recall from speaking to you last year, it was a little dry and short and cold, or is that correct?
It was dry and hot, not cold. So lack of water means shorter season. It means it's harder to keep your cows happy. It means it's harder to have consistency. It's harder to clean. It's harder to manage your pasture. And warmer means, well, what it means is the cheese stays for a shorter time on the mountain. It comes down quicker than usual to us because the cellars can't really be cooled down enough. Again, they were designed pre-global warming times, so that's what they're dealing with. And then again, warmer means perhaps the milk won't be as abundant as usual. The cheese won't be following the same acidification curve as usual.
So as far as last year's season goes, does this mean that the cows themselves, you know, the cheesemaker and the cows were moving up the mountain? If they have multiple sites, are they moving up the mountain faster in order to kind of chase fresher grass? Is the grass at lower elevations just burning off and they're having to kind of like chase it up the mountain?
Yeah, well, they just had to go through each pasture quicker than usual because there was less feed available, so you ran out quicker than usual.
Is hay something that they're banking from the previous summer for if this happens, or is there any way to have an insurance policy in that way?
As a general principle, you do not bring hay to a chalet.
On a bad season like that, on a rough season, does the association give special dispensation for this?
They do, yeah.
Bring them water, or do they allow them to shorten the season, make smaller wheels? Like what are the
so the association has nothing to do with water. That's animal welfare. What they have to do with is hay. So they have on several occasions allowed producers to bring hay up, which in all fairness doesn't make sense because there's no reason to bring hay from the valley if you're making cheese on the Alp. So that's one thing the association is involved with. The other being water that they're not involved with. And this is where the government sometimes steps in. And there's been the well-known helicopter rides for bringing water to some sites.
Wait, what does this mean? So they can actually move water by helicopter, and what do they do? Fill up troughs? Like, how does that work?
Do you know what happens in California when there's a fire?
Right, and they come down and they sort of pick up all this water out of the lake.
So almost like this. No, because they don't just drop water on the chalet. They basically fill, and then they bring tanks up, and then the tanks stay up.
That's quite a lot of effort to preserve what a lot of people might see as kind of a historical anomaly anyway. So
yeah,
just that, the work involved in that tells me that this must be a very culturally significant thing if they're willing to take this kind of move in order to preserve it instead of just having the cows come down and say, well, you know, bad season, maybe next year.
Well, I think if you ask me, I think there's several things involved. So first and foremost, there's money. So these producers make money on making cheese during the summertime. So if you remove this, then there's no more money.
Right.
Okay. So after that, it comes to animal welfare. Cows drink 100 liters of up to 100 liters per cow per day when it's warm. That's like 30 gallons.
Yeah.
So that's a lot of water.
Yeah.
And this means the warmer it gets, the larger the amount of water is necessary. And then I'd say there's also a certain pride in being able to produce cheese on your Alp. So they'll do whatever is necessary for that, whatever
Yeah.
it takes. It's like in the ski resorts when they bring snow to start the season with helicopters.
Right.
There comes a point where you have to ask yourself, are there not too many cows on your estate for how it was designed all the years back all those years? And is your estate run in a way that it can be still run in 20 years from now? I guess in most cases the answer is no.
How is production managed by an association? Is it similar to Gruyere AOP, where there's a quota that they're intended to make?
So that's from the government. That's just government regulations. What the AOP says is X amount of pounds per year, and that's it.
Do your producers generally hit that maximum?
They do. Yep.
How many Alpage dairies do you work with at Fromage Gruyere?
We work with around 15 in total.
And those are all from around Fribourg or other areas?
Not just. So we have around half of that. Half of that number are from Fribourg, and the other half is from Jura. The main difference is that Fribourg uses fire, and in general, Jura doesn't, and they produce in bigger numbers. So it's not half and half. Jura obviously produces more.
One last thing about 2019. So you said that the cheeses were coming down more frequently because of the issues of the heat in the cellar. Did this mean that do you find it to be different because of that reason? Do you find that can you drill down to the amount of time it spends on in its own cellar as opposed to in your cellar, and how that might change the flavor, the texture, or anything about that?
What I could understand from what happened is everything is fine until it's not anymore. So you're not going to find qualities in bringing down the cheese earlier than usual because it's usually good, right? The cheese is not going to get better. However, it could get worse if it stays there for too long, meaning greasing, for example. That's a typical phenomenon.
So, which is where more fat is kind of leaching out on the rind. Is that?
Yeah, it's like sweating.
Sweating, yeah, which gives you that kind of just texturally, it really bonds the cheese.
Yeah, especially the exterior. So not so much inside, but mostly outside.
Yeah. So through trial and error over many, many years, this has been just figured out that on a hot year, you need to bring it down a little sooner.
Yeah, because they have ideal working temperature ranges.
Yeah.
And then when it gets outside of those ranges, then they react.
Okay, so with the dairies you work with, so 15 or so Alpage dairies, do you have long-standing agreements, contracts? Like how do cheesemakers move their cheeses from affineur to affineur, or are these families that Fromage Gruyere has been involved with for generations?
So more so than with village dairies that we age 30 of, a lot of these estates are still owned today by one of the founding families of our business back in 1916. So one of those families owns um, 3 or 4 of those chalets, and obviously they supply to us because the owner is a founding member of the company.
And when you
So
say you mean that there's a large swath of mountain
owned
in
by a family.
owned by a family, and then on that mountain there are these chalets that they're leasing to another family to make cheese, and that's not just a small relationship. That can be for years and years and years and
Yeah.
years.
So they have contracts together. We're not involved in those. We have contracts with the cheesemakers, so the farmers, not the landlords. Um, and as for every affineur, we sign the contract. We sign each contract every December. So be Village Dairy or Alpage, each contract is renewed or cancelled in December each year.
Yes.
So
Considering
this is when you take them out for a good dinner.
yeah, sure. Considering all of the pressures of modern life, globalization, kids not necessarily wanting to be farmers like their parents, and all of that, are you seeing a lot of the rights to produce cheese at these chalets changing from family to family, or does it stay consistent? Is there how much transience is there in the chalet cheesemaking population?
So because it's Swiss and because it's agriculture, not much.
Is the training to do an Alpage production the same? Is it the same level as like where you went to the National Dairy School, and is it the same rigorous training, or is there more of a long internship within? It's just such a specific type of production. I wonder if are you still a dairy technologist?
No, I wouldn't, because there's a lot more to the job than just making cheese. I mean, in a village dairy, you have electricity. So if the chances of something going wrong are very slim. However, on the mountain, it could very well be that on June 1st, you have snow. So obviously your milk will be quite different, as it's going to be 2 weeks apart from that date. You can have a storm, so part of your chalet can be destroyed. You can have like a chimney fire. Does that make sense to you? I've heard of like a chimney fire this summer. So because of all the soot,
Yeah.
the chimney caught fire. So this is basically a problem for cheese making, because you have to stop immediately. Um,
Yeah.
so your cows can be sick, for example. One cow can trip, and you have to take care of a cow. You're late. I don't know. It's
Very different
so
job than just
yes, so
yeah.
much more relies on your shoulders, because you're a cheesemaker, so you have to make good enough cheese, but you're also a farmer, and the two together means you're an independent business owner who has to make a profit during the summer.
Have you spent a lot of time in one of these dairies? Like, I've did you spend a summer up there? Like, how did you kind of get to know the Alpage dairies?
So this is how I got into cheese making, was by accident, was carrying cow poop on an alpage. And I got to know my wife on this alpage that summer, and I got to know my my next boss, who would teach me how to make cheese in a village dairy. So that was a very productive summer. Much cow poop involved.
Well, there's always a lot of cow poop. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the dairies that we work with from you. So I think the first dairy that we started with 6 or 7 years ago was Sheno. Chenault is, tell us where Chenault is, its relative age, who runs it. Just what do you know about Chenault?
So Chenault is in a separate area from two of the other sites that we supply you from. Chenault is close to the Letiva area, so it's at one of the edges of Fribourg, in a beautiful area. Well, none of the sites are really in a not beautiful area, but it's several sites, so transhumans during the summer as well, and run by one single family for many years now. Yeah,
Okay.
and then it's going to be
Does it?
it's well, their name is Bushung, and it's going to be a father-son transition most likely.
Oh, like they're in the midst of that generational shift.
So I know, yes.
Yeah, interesting. So tell us about Chenault from 2019. What should we be looking for from this cheese?
Because moisture in 2019 was higher for some reason, so the cheese was made with a higher moisture content. It might be that the taste will be a little more advanced than usual in comparison with other sites, for example, or previous years. So this can be good.
From a science standpoint, how can drier pastures lead to a higher moisture cheese?
It's all down to cultures. It's heat, so drainage of your curd, and also the size you cut the curd, for example. All this combined, and also maybe the amount of pressing. Yes.
So do you feel like this is an example of a cheesemaker adjusting for what the season is in a really effective?
Maybe I haven't asked him, but it's probable. Maybe.
So the first cheeses that we have from Chenault, and can you explain this to me? So we get them in two batches every fall. The first batch is from earlier in the summer. You refer to them as 13 and 14. Can you explain this
Yeah,
to me?
so I would have to double check what I'm saying, but usually we send with the first batch from the first half of the summer. This is what you said, 13. Our 13th month of the year is May, June, July productions, and then 14th month is August, September, October. So we would tend to send cheese from production 13, which is the first half, to you with the first shipment, and then 14 with the second shipment.
Chenault is relatively high elevation, or when we talk about elevation, I guess, where do they start and where do they end? Do you have a sense of where they are in these sites? Is there like a minimum elevation and a maximum elevation that they can produce cheese?
Well, basically, the idea, it's quite natural because the more you go up, the less grass you have and also the less wood you have. So there's a natural barrier to the altitude you can produce cheese at. And then obviously in our area, mountains aren't really that high. It's not the Matterhorn. We don't have perpetual snow. So you would start around 3,300 meters. Yes. And then maybe you would sometimes end up to 5,500 meters, feet, sorry.
Feet. Yeah. So about 1,600 meters and then up from there. And so is that up to like a frost line, or that's just up to where the season's so short that the growth is negligible?
Yeah, it's all of these combined. So they go up and then they go back down. Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
And then they would sometimes go to the top one only once because there's the season up there is so short. If you compare this to bees, I think maybe I'm just saying stupid stuff, but for every 300 feet, the season is 1 week shorter.
I guess what I had never really thought about is are there times where they're moving in between the same two chalets, depending on how the pasture is kind of coming up, how the grass is growing?
Yeah, so there can be some going up, down, and back up again. It's all depending on rotation. So they have an ideal rotation, but it can be that one year maybe, I don't know, they've been cutting wood somewhere, so the pasture was busy, or I don't know. They have to do like a special trick that year and maybe do the rotation the other way around. But they have a set scheme that they usually try to follow from year to year, an
Yeah.
ideal scheme.
Yeah.
Because then the further you go away from the chalet, the further the cows have to walk, and the more energy they spend walking, the less milk arrives at the chalet. This is why in some cultures, but not this culture, they milk on site. So the dairy goes to the pasture. In this case, it's the opposite. The pasture comes to the dairy. The cows go to the production site to be milked, and then the milk is transformed into cheese on site. Usually that's how it happens. There are exceptions, but that's the idea.
Another dairy that I think you and I visited is Gruyere, which we'll
Yes.
go on to now. Now, if I recall, when we were there, it had been rebuilt. Is this right? It's not the original, like the one we went to wasn't the original site, or what was that about?
There's two sites, and the two of them burned down, maybe 1 or 2 years apart from each other, in like the mid 90s, quite stupidly because of army training. The military has trainings in that area after the cows and the farmers leave the chalet. So that's like October, November. So they have exercises, and they shoot mortar
Yeah.
in that area. And so what they do is sometimes they sleep at night in that chalet, um, just during the exercise season. And so from what I heard, there was a lot of fog, and they made fire in that chalet just to keep warm. And for some reason, when they woke up or came back the next day, the chalet wasn't here anymore. But they couldn't see because of the fog.
So in that case, it must be difficult for the landowner or the cheesemaker to recreate what are in one of these historical buildings. Is this because going to it, it doesn't look. I mean, it looks
Pretty
new.
wooden.
Right. But it does, it's not like all of a sudden they dropped a modern building onto the site. You know, they didn't sort of technologically take advantage of the situation. It's still the same hanging vat and wood fire
Yeah.
and big chimney and all of that. So
But in this case, it checks out because Good Air is the most modern of all these sites. Like, it's been rebuilt using, I don't know, concrete tiles,
yeah.
because it was in the mid 90s. So there wasn't really a point in not using concrete whenever necessary.
And there, if I recall, their cellar is on the same level as the cheese making as opposed to being under the
Mm-hmm.
chalet.
Yeah.
Which seemed unusual just from like a temperature regulation standpoint, but I guess from a practical sense, it does make a lot of sense.
So you can find both scenarios where the cellar, um, we call that a salting place, on those places, on those estates, is sometimes separate and on one level, so no digging, but it's separate. So either in a place where there's a lot of shade, or if it's easier to access, or I don't know, access to water, no idea. Um, in that case, they must have found a way to have the new cellar next to the chalet if it wasn't there already, and they must have decided that it was cool enough. But
Yeah.
in last year's case, I know that the cheese came to us earlier than usual, so no exception there.
So tell us about Goodare 2019. What do you know? Um, is it typical for the style? I personally always like Gruyere. I find it to be like really robust. When I'm tasting an Gruyere d'Alpage, I kind of want it to be as different from a village dairy cheese as possible in order to kind of like really demonstrate its place on the counter. Gruyere's always done that for me. Is this year any different?
So this year is no different because what we've seen is Gruyere is usually the best of the batch,
Yeah.
or the most pleasing of all chalets that we can supply you with. The one with the most balanced flavor and the ideal Alpage flavor that everybody likes, like robust, some smoke, but not too much. Let's just remind people that the smoke doesn't come from artificial flavoring or smoking of the cheese. It's just because the cheese is made over fire and cheese is made of 1/3 fat. This smoke gives taste to the curd inside the vat, which is then found inside of the cheese. So the cheese comes from, the smoke taste comes from the fire produced to heat the curd.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess to compare the first two we've spoken about, Chanot to me has always been more approachable, and probably something that if you're kind of wading in on the Alpage side, it's very recognizable from a Gruyere perspective, but Gruyere has that kind of more kind of to it that I think it looks like. Next, let's talk about Surman. As far as smokiness goes, the chalets I visited, it tends to be the most smoke filled. It's a very small room by comparison to Branlaire Gruyere, right? It's a pretty compact space.
That has to do with either space, so space available, or maybe the direction of the winds blowing that day. There can be some like back smoking inside the chalet, or I also know some chalets have been designed with a chimney facing the wrong way. So, well, it's basically like designing airport runways, right? You look at the dominant winds, and then you're so there's a cap on the chimney, and the cap has to protect the smoke, preventing it from going back inside the house for most of the days during the summer. But there has been wrong designs around. I don't know if Sermon is one of those, but it does exist.
So tell us about Surman. Surman, if people have seen a lot of kind of our pictures of Alpage dairy, Surman has been, it's an extremely photogenic place. It's beautifully positioned. It's on the Molaison.
Yeah, it's facing the Molaison, so it's like there.
Yeah, so it's like right there. Just a beautiful rustic Alpage dairy. Tell us about the cheese. It took us a while. I think initially we visited and we were told like no cheese is available. And then I think the third time we visited the dairy, you allowed us to take maybe 5 wheels of cheese. So is this a factor of the limited production at Surman, or is it just really a more popular dairy for people to be buying from?
No, it's a factor of how nice we are to you.
Yeah, well, of course.
But no, it's just there's so many wheels. There's that many wheels available per year, and that's it. And it's not a big producer, and I think, like you said, because of all the exposure from the tourism. Remember, it's very close to Gruyere. It might be that the producer himself buys a lot of his own cheese so that he can sell to either shops or himself directly.
And what about Branlaire? So Branlaire is it was the third one that we originally selected. At the time, it was in the hands of the father, was it Christophe?
Benoit, that's his father.
Benoit. Okay, so Benoit was making the cheese. It was really highly regarded. I know since it has changed, is Christophe the son?
He is, and Benoit was, and well, Benoit is still on our board, on our company's board.
So the cheese is now being made by Christoph, and I assume it must have changed with that transition. So how do you find the cheese to be different? Do you have a preference? It seems like there's always the opinion of the affineur, there's the opinion of the marketplace, and then there's the opinion of the association. So is this a case where the association doesn't regard it as highly as they maybe once did, but there's qualities that the marketplace might prefer? Gudera is an example of a cheese that never seemed to be getting high marks, but we always really enjoyed.
Right. So what we've noticed is that the transition brought sometimes a shorter paste, meaning it's a little bit drier, but the positive aspect is that you can age it for longer, if that makes sense to you.
Yeah.
So you might be able to keep it for a big amount, like couple or 3 or 4 or 6 or 8 months longer than previously. That's a positive trade-off, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, it is. It's interesting, and it's almost to the point where we've established a pretty good take of Alpage every year, and we've actually considered kind of splitting it out even further to take certain cheeses earlier in the season and other cheeses later in the season. I think it's a good note there that Bromlair would be something that we could consider transitioning into even late winter as far as when we import it. So that's good to know. So 2020 has been an interesting year for us. Can you just tell us a little bit about, we're speaking now in early September. So typically the Desalp would be in about 2 or 3 weeks, the cows would start coming down traditionally. What's this season been like? How have global events changed things? Have they? Is there room in the cellar, or just can you give us an idea of what 2020 looks like from an Alpage cheesemaker perspective?
I'm seeing now Desalps are canceled, obviously. I believe the herds will sometimes walk down instead of being in trailers, but it's just there won't be gatherings. But yeah, the herds that usually walk down, they will still walk down, except no gatherings.
Which seems like a real shame from what you're saying. This has been a very good season, and it would be nice to be able to celebrate it, but this is not the era we live in.
Mm-hmm. It is what it is.
It is what it is. All right. Well, we'll look forward to those 2020 cheeses next year.
Let's try to be positive, Jonathan. 2020 has been a great year for Alpage cheese making. Not too warm, not too dry. Spring was kind of dry and everybody was worried, but then everything got back to normal, and it has been a fast but early season, and it seems everybody's happy until now.
So until we see you again, this has been a difficult year. We usually have an opportunity to come over right about now and visit you and taste the cheeses. And this year was disappointing in that respect for sure. But thanks for joining us, and I appreciate your insight. And let's do it again soon.
You're welcome. Right. If this helps people to get a feel of whatever is happening here, just afar, I'm happy.
Very good. Thank you.
All right.